Hey everybody, this is Pastor Joshua Sullivan, pastor of Holy Cross Lutheran Church, Kerrville, Texas, answering your questions with Ask the Pastor, ATP. Today we've got a good one, especially considering it's political primary season. It's a question about abortion, and basically, are there any exceptions to this? Someone writes, Dear Pastor, I have a very important question, which is, are there any exceptions to abortion, particularly in the life of the mother scenario, given what the Bible says in regards to the sin of partiality, and the biblical definition of murder, which is the taking of innocent life? Good question, and you've asked it in a very thoughtful way as well. It sounds like you already have an answer based on the way that you've asked this, but I think I like where you're going to go with this. So this is, like I said, this is a very timely question because the idea of exceptions that allow for abortion is an idea that does not come from the scriptures, as far as I know, and neither does it really come from the history of the church or anywhere. It comes from one place, and that is specifically from the political arena. This is the question you hear all the time whenever a conservative is trying to get elected into office. This is one of those crazy traps that's laid, and every politician always seems to walk into it. And some folks, on both sides, want them to walk into it for different reasons. It's, are there any exceptions to abortion? And you bring up one, the life of the mother. We also have conception in the case of rape, and I think the third one is in the case of incest. And what I would posit is that the idea that there are exceptions to the commandment, thou shalt not murder, the fact that there are exceptions to this do not come from scriptures, do not come from doing good theology, but simply come from the political arena. And think about it this way. What is the chief virtue of politicians in our system of doing things? And that is compromise. You hear about it all the time. Working across the aisle. Compromise is the lowest common denominator. Compromise is the best you can hope for in the way that our political system is structured. And that has both its pros and cons. That's a whole different topic, and frankly, not one for Ask the Pastor. But the idea of these exceptions, I believe, comes from the idea of political compromise, and it is one that is seeped into the pro-life movement to a certain extent, or that's debatable to what extent it has. So I think, as you've pointed out here, we have two things. We have the sin of partiality, and we also have the definition of murder as taking an innocent life. And so first of all, you've got the fifth commandment, thou shalt not murder. And so that's an open and shut case, in my humble opinion. Now, you bring up the life of the mother scenario, which I think is probably the one that we hear the least about, simply because of the advances of modern technology, of modern medical technology. Those situations where the life of the mother is threatened if she has this child to full term, those are becoming fewer and far betweener. Fewer and far betweener? Sure, fewer and far betweener. So we hear about this less and less and less. Now, however, put yourself back in the shoes of somebody that existed basically before the advent of modern medicine. Think about in biblical times. Jesus talks about in John chapter 16. This was part of the gospel lesson for, I think, 3 Sundays ago, Jubilate. And that is talking about a woman in travail because her time is near. He's talking about the pregnant woman being in travail because she knows that the hour of the delivery has come. Now, I've never given birth to a baby, and I don't intend on ever doing that. But from what I can tell, just based on watching my wife do it several times, it's not the most pleasant experience. And all of our female viewers out there are going hardy har har, of course. But no, this is something that in the ancient Near East especially, and really all over the world before the advent of modern medicine, women didn't always know how it was going to end up. Nobody knew how it was going to end up because you didn't have sonograms, you didn't have all this technology. You couldn't tell if the baby was going to be born breech or not, or if the cord was wrapped around its neck, or they had made a lasso out of it, or all these sorts of things. And so women and their husbands always had to approach childbirth completely trusting in the mercy of God, because a woman doesn't even know, biblically speaking, if she's going to make it out of this thing alive, let alone if the child is going to be making it out alive. So until the advent of modern medicine, all of these sorts of things were a moot point. It was, when I conceive, is up to the Lord. We'll get back to that in just a moment. But then when it comes time for me to give birth to the baby, my life is in God's hands. My child's life is in God's hands. And so with the psalmist, we say, Lord, into thy hands I commit myself. We say, along with Luther at his morning and evening prayers in the small catechism, into thy hands I commit myself, my body and soul and all things. And so modern medicine has really taken away a lot of the need for faith, or at least has taken away the perception of the need for faith. Now, any woman out there that's actually given birth to a baby knows that it requires a whole lot of faith that the Lord is going to get you and your child through that, as well as the dad that's standing there holding the woman's hand. So I think from that point of view, the life of the mother one is one that you hear less and less about. Now, it's still there. But now you bring this up as far as with the sin of partiality, which life is more important. I think that's what you're getting at. And again, all of this goes back to just the fact of, if God gives conception, or when God gives conception, as with everything in this life, our lives are lived entirely by God's mercy. And on top of this, whatever God gives us is his good and gracious will. And if evil things do happen, we know that God will even bring his good and gracious will out of those things. So let's use that as a way to jump to the other two exceptions which are always used, which is conception in the case of rape and in incest. Now, those are both terribly sinful acts, and those acts need to be condemned. Those acts have no place amongst the people of God, and they really have no place amongst humanity. That is just the fact that rape and incest happen. That is a direct result of the fact that everyone is born sinful, that we by nature have Adam's guilt and Adam's sin, and we just see the world devolving with each generation, it seems. So we cannot excuse those acts, nor can we ever say that it's God's will that such evil acts happen. However, we don't use that as an instance to say, well, you can kill the baby then, if the baby is conceived based on this, and for two reasons. The first is, conception always comes from the Lord. For those of you out there that have tried to have children and cannot conceive, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We are not the ones that get to decide when we conceive. Now, we see our society doing all sorts of stupid things, going overboard on both sides. You have some folks, that want to use birth control ad infinitum, so that they get to enjoy the desires of the flesh with no biological God-given consequences whatsoever. And so they suppress life in that way. But then you also have on the other side those who worship this almost as its own God and worship it with the liturgy of in vitro fertilization and whatnot, which has a whole slew of other problems. So look at the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, the Lord only does, I believe, 2 verbs, maybe 3. I think it's 2. In the first chapter, it's the Lord that sends the famine. The Lord gives the famine. And then in chapter 4, the Lord gives Ruth conception. And so we also see the same thing going on in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2 with Hannah. The Lord is the one who ultimately gives Elkanah and Hannah conception. And so in all of these things, it's the Lord that gives life. He gives it through a very specific act, which he has ordained and called good, but he's the one that ultimately gets to decide. Now, the other reason that I'm going to come down on this and say, keep the child if it's even conceived through incest or rape, and that is, let's see, we talked about, the answer is Joseph in Egypt. I know that seems odd, but follow me on this. And it is not God's will that people be raped or that people conceive through incest. Those are sinful acts, and God does not will sin. He's not the author of evil. Psalm 5, verse 4, no wickedness can dwell with him. He doesn't plot this stuff out. However, when these things do happen, God still can use human acts of evil and bring great good out of them. And that's why I bring up Joseph in Egypt. Joseph is sold by his brothers in Genesis 37, I believe. He is sold into slavery by his brothers. And then you get him, he's bought by Potiphar. Then he's thrown into prison there for alleged rape. Then he gets eventually to be the chief vizier, the prime minister of Egypt, in charge of everything. And Joseph says twice in the book of Genesis, when he's dealing with his brothers, finally, as the story concludes and everything's being brought to its pinnacle, he says, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. And so from that, we see that God can take even the most vile sins that are perpetrated upon others, and he can turn them into great salvations for people. Joseph even says, all of this was allowed so that the Lord could work this great salvation for the saving of many lives. And not just the people's lives who were there in famine in Israel, but also the lives of the entire world, because in the loins of his brother Levi, that is the Messianic line. I'm sorry, in the lines of Judah. Where did that come from? In the loins of Judah, there's the Messianic strain, the Messianic line. So are there any exceptions? The quick and dirty answer is no. And ultimately it's because God's the one that gives conception, and that even in horrific and terrible sinful acts, which God does condemn, he can still bring good things out of that. He does that all throughout the Scriptures. He does that throughout the passion and suffering of our Lord Jesus Christ, in bringing about the greatest good for all mankind by atoning for the sins of the world, so that all who believe in him can have that righteousness and atonement. This is just something that we see God doing, and something that we're able to look to him and put our trust in him, that even when these things happen, we know that God's wisdom is far wiser than anything that we can reason and concoct ourselves. And so it's important that we as Christians not stick with the whims of political compromise and let things from the political and cultural war be imported into our faith, but rather that our faith comes solely from the Holy Scriptures, and we do our theology from there and from there alone. Thanks for the question. Awesome question. If you've got questions out there about this or about any topic, send me an email. The email address is atpholycross@gmail.com, atpholycross@gmail.com, and I'll answer them as soon as I'm able. And if you're watching this on Wednesday, make sure, if you're in the Kerrville area, to tune your radio dial on the AM side to KERV 1230, where Ask the Pastor will be hitting the airwaves live today at 2 p.m. following Rush Limbaugh. We'll see you then.